What if the greatest economic institutions of our modern age have roots stretching back not just decades, but millennia? And what if those roots are intertwined with forces most people only read about in ancient texts, or perhaps, only whisper about? Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're embarking on a truly ambitious investigation. We're drawing from a stack of pretty incredible source material, primarily a deep dive analysis titled The Roots of the Federal Reserve and Connections to Nephilim. Our mission for this deep dive is to uncover what this author claims are the ancient, hidden origins of the Federal Reserve and its purported connections to forces, well, beyond our conventional understanding. As always, our role here is to distill and present the author's arguments impartially, helping you understand this unique and often provocative viewpoint. We're not here to endorse or refute the claims themselves, just lay them out for you.
What's truly fascinating here is how the author takes us on this journey. It weaves through history, spirituality, epigenetics, all to argue that the prevailing narratives about our economic systems are, as the source puts it, hogwash. And this perspective, it raises a really important question. What if the stability we perceive in our financial world is actually a carefully crafted illusion? It really challenges us to look beyond the surface.
Absolutely. And our goal for you, the listener, is to distill the author's complex and often startling arguments. Connecting these seemingly disparate threads, historical, spiritual, financial, we want to give you a shortcut to being well-informed about this highly unconventional perspective, exploring the surprising facts and, frankly, bold claims presented in the source material. We'll provide the insights you need to grasp this unique viewpoint. So let's begin by understanding the author's approach. How does she even get here?
Okay, so to set the stage, we're looking at the work of Dr. Laura Sanger, PhD. Her primary research method is something she calls spiritual mapping. Now, this term, it was actually coined back in 1991 by George Otis Jr. of the Sentinel Group. Dr. Sanger describes spiritual mapping as essentially a tool to inform intercession. It's meant to guide people as they pray for specific lands, communities, and nations.
Okay, spiritual mapping. And when you say that, what exactly does that involve beyond just, prayer? It sounds quite specific.
Oh, it is indeed. Spiritual mapping, as she describes it, involves gathering extensive research across three key dimensions of a society: the physical, the social, and spiritual. The core idea, as the author explains, is to dig deeply through history to uncover what she refers to as ancient roots of defilement. The ultimate purpose, then, according to Dr. Sanger, is to cleanse the land. And this happens by asking for forgiveness through a process she calls identificational repentance, which basically means confessing the historical sins of a place or people as if they were your own. And through this process, the goal is to break curses and release blessings. The overarching aim of this method, she states, is to see people, societies, and nations transformed for the glory of the Lord. So yeah, it's a very specific, spiritually driven research methodology, aiming for societal change.
Right. So with that methodology in mind, the author doesn't just suggest the Federal Reserve is flawed in some, minor way. She goes right for a deeply provocative claim: the whole narrative that a central bank is necessary for economic stability, dismissed as hogwash. And in fact, the author posits the exact opposite. The claim is quite stark, that the Federal Reserve created both the Great Recession of 2008-2010 and the Great Depression. The source explicitly states it's what they do. The evidence of this will be revealed in the pages of this book. That's certainly a bold accusation right from the start.
Yeah, from this perspective, the author is positing a deliberate, destabilizing force right at the heart of our financial system. The text sets out to reveal the evidence of this, and our deep dive, well, we're going to follow that trail. This isn't just a subtle critique, it's framed as a profound indictment of the institution's very purpose. An uncovering of a hidden agenda, really.
Okay, so to guide this rather intense investigation, the author poses several crucial questions. These questions, she says, form the parameters of our investigation, and they are quite broad. She asks, are there ancient pagan or occult symbols that shed light on the Federal Reserve's root system? Is the hidden agenda of central banking intertwined with what she calls a Nephilim agenda? Who were the architects of the Federal Reserve Act, and what was their original intent? Who are the masterminds controlling the course of our nation? What has been the impact of the Federal Reserve on our economy and, well, the American psyche? What principality do the masterminds of the Federal Reserve serve? A spiritual entity, she suggests. And finally, is there hope? Can we chart a different course from the debt cycle created? The author promises twists and turns that you cannot anticipate, asserting that the story begins thousands of years ago. So I guess let's buckle up and dive into those ancient roots.
All right. Our deep dive into the Federal Reserve's alleged ancient roots begins with a specific modern historical event: The clandestine meeting at Jekyll Island in November 1910. This covert gathering of powerful men, as the source notes, is presented as the definitive starting point of what the author describes as a path toward destruction for the U.S. financial system. It was here, over 9 days, that the framework for the Federal Reserve emerged.
It's intriguing, though, that the author immediately signals the true seeds of the Federal Reserve weren't just planted on Jekyll Island in 1910, but thousands of years earlier. So to really understand this modern financial system, we're being asked to time travel way back to ancient history. At this secret Jekyll Island meeting, the key figures involved included Senator Aldrich, who was, driving the agenda, and Paul Warburg, who was largely responsible for actually drafting the plan. This gathering is described in the source as changing the course of our nation, putting it on a path toward destruction. The author really challenges us to consider if the roots of the Federal Reserve were indeed planted long before the nation's birth.
Exactly. And to truly trace these purported ancient roots, we first need to understand a pervasive symbol the author highlights. The circumpunct. The seemingly simple design, just a dot within a circle, apparently carries immense sacred meaning across diverse cultures. And it's appeared since the Archaic and Neolithic periods. Its most ancient roots, the source details, are found in Egyptian worship of the sun god. There it served as a solar phallic symbol representing the eternal nature of the sun god Ra. In fact, the Egyptian hieroglyph for the sun itself is a circumpunct.
Right. And the symbolism attributed to it by the author is quite explicit, isn't it? The circumpunct is described as a two-dimensional phallic symbol. The dot represents the penis, the circle represents the womb. This connection, according to the author, extends to the many obelisks, towers, and pyramids found across Egypt. These are presented as symbolic expressions of sun worship and erect male organs pointing toward the sun. The source then highlights two prominent modern locations featuring these conspicuous obelisks strategically positioned within circles: St. Peter's Square in Rome and Washington, D.C., and the St. Peter's obelisk, notably, was erected in 41 A.D., but originally stood at Heliopolis, an ancient center of Egyptian sun worship. That seems significant in this context.
It does. And if we connect this to the broader argument, the author points to this symbol's universal spiritual significance, even while its specific meaning varies across contexts. Yes, it's often tied to Earth's orbital path and sun worship, but philosophically it can represent wholeness and unity. But what's particularly striking is that Manly P. Hall, a prominent 33rd degree Freemason, is quoted as having called it the keys to all magic. That's quite a statement. Now, the provocative interpretation offered by the author is that these structures, the obelisk and the accompanying dome like the Capitol building, were believed to become energy receivers, assimilating Ray's essence from the sun's rays. This, she claims, would then draw forth the seed of the underworld Osiris, magically emitting it from the tower's peak into the womb, which is the dome of Isis. This ritual was, according to this view, for incarnation into the sitting Pharaoh King president during what Freemasons apparently refer to as a raising ceremony. The implication here, laid out in the source, is that Osiris is essentially born again to direct the spiritual destiny of the nation.
Wow, okay. That's a lot to take in right there. From the circumpunct as a central symbol, our journey then takes us to megalithic stone circles and ley lines. The author notes the proliferation of these circumpunct-like formations in megalithic civilizations dating way back between 5000 BC and 2000 BC. Stonehenge, for instance, dating back to 3100 2750 BC, is just one of over 1,000 stone circles found in England alone. And the source highlights how advanced technology like ground-penetrating radar has uncovered 17 previously unknown Neolithic shrines around Stonehenge, some in the form of circumpuncts. This suggests, the author argues, that Stonehenge was part of a larger sacred landscape long before its famous stones were erected. Vincent Gaffney, a lead archaeologist, is quoted stating that Stonehenge is part of a much more complex landscape with processional and ritual activities.
Right. And within the archaeological community, there's definitely been some debate about the exact purpose of these megalithic structures. For instance, Higginbotham's theory suggests Neolithic people possessed a really sophisticated understanding of sun and moon cycles, astronomical patterns. However, Kenneth Brophy offers a critique. He argues that applying modern mathematical techniques to prehistoric people might be flawed. There's just no other archaeological evidence, he says, to support such a mathematical worldview from that era. Instead, Brophy proposes these monuments were built with close attention to the land itself, representing power and ritual, often chosen for previous sacred events, particularly for social rituals, especially those performed to honor the dead. He observed that stone circles were frequently aligned so that one could be viewed from another, implying a connection to what we now call ley lines.
Okay, ley lines. And that leads us right to that concept. What are they exactly in this context? How does the author define them? The author brings in Alistair Petrie, who describes them as ancient pathways, not just physical routes, but migration routes, points of entry, influenced by an ancient religious worldview and what he terms covenants with gods. The term ley lines itself was coined by Alfred Watkins back in 1921. He defined them as distinct alignments of ancient burial mounds, monuments, ditches, other features, which he argued were undeniably intentional, used for guiding paths and signaling with beacons. The text suggests these alignments were like a fairy chain stretched from mountain peak to mountain peak, with specific markers like mounds and standing stones.
Exactly. And continuing this exploration of alleged occult influences, the source directs our attention to Torino, Italy, a city identified as deeply steeped in this tradition. The Frejus Tunnel Monument, built in 1864, is presented as a really striking example. It's shaped like a pyramid, right? With a dark angel at the top, which locals reportedly believe to be Lucifer. It has an inverted pentagram on its head and statues of titans depicted in agony at its base. There's even a sealed grate at the monument's base that some believe is a gate to hell. This leads the author to suggest that dark occurrences aren't just coincidences in this location, but linked to its inherent spiritual landscape.
And the claims extend beyond just individual monuments, right? The city's layout itself is said to be part of this esoteric design. At Piazza Castello, there are two horsemen statues, Pollux and Castor. The author describes them as marking the dividing point between black and white magic within the city. Pollux, who has an inverted pentagram, faces the dark angel at Piazza Statuto, while Castor faces the Gran Madre. And the Savoy family, a powerful historical dynasty, according to Elena Perotti cited in the source, even built their residence in Piazza Castello on the explicit advice of master alchemists. These alchemists reportedly revealed a secret concerning the location of the alchemical caves of Torino.
Right. And this deep analysis of symbols and urban planning is where the unfiltered truth, as the source might frame it, really starts to manifest. The author's building a case here that these symbols and alignments aren't just architectural whims. They're deliberate conduits for spiritual forces, linking places like Washington, D.C., Rome, and Torino to these ancient occultic roots. The source highlights 5 prominent Savoy structures: the Basilica Superga, Rivoli Castle, Palace of Venoria, Moncalier Castle, and Palace of Stupingi, that encircle Torino, forming a pentagram within a circle. Their placement, it's claimed, was absolutely not coincidental, but designed with precise alchemical intent to maximize the convergence of power across the region.
Okay, so from Italy, our journey continues as we delve into the civilizations responsible for these megalithic architectural wonders. And this brings us closer to the alleged Nephilim connection. We revisit the Sapelo shell rings in Georgia, dating back to 4200-3000 BC. The author notes their striking resemblance to European megalithic circumpuncts, and poses some intriguing questions about these sites. How did these archaic period hunter-gatherers suddenly become an agricultural society with pottery-making technology? It seems like a sudden leap. Did they migrate from a more progressive civilization, bringing these skills with them? Were they, in fact, connected to other megalithic architects across the globe? The pottery artifacts found at Sapelo were presented as strong evidence that these inhabitants were not merely hunter-gatherers, challenging the conventional historical narratives about their development.
Exactly. And this leads us to consider other megalithic marvels and their mysterious builders, who are often attributed by fringe theories, and this author, to forces beyond typical human capability. Baalbek, for instance, in Lebanon. It's described as a megalithic wonder, so immense that its construction is presented as difficult for Western minds to even comprehend. The source mentions theories pointing to extraterrestrial species, or giants, as the architects. It notes that the giant named Og, king of Bashan, once ruled from nearby Mount Hermon, providing a potential connection within this framework.
And then there's the Great Pyramid of Egypt, which the author calls a mystery and a league of its own. The source challenges the traditional view of the Great Pyramid of Giza as just a tomb for pharaohs, suggesting this might only be true for the earlier stepped pyramids. And here's where the author presents a truly provocative claim, the Weishaupt allegation. Scott Crichton's scrupulous investigative work, as presented in the source, suggests that Colonel Weiss, back in 1837, actually forged the Khufu cartouche, those are the quarry marks, to legitimize Khufu as the builder of the Great Pyramid. If this allegation is true, the author claims it would be the biggest hoax in archaeological history, completely reshaping our understanding of who built this monumental structure.
Right, so if the long-accepted narrative about Khufu building the Great Pyramid is potentially a hoax, then the question naturally arises, who did build it? This question, as the author states, brings us to the precipice of a paradigm shift for many of us who have been raised on traditional historical theories. To help navigate these profound shifts in understanding, the source introduces George Otis Jr.'s Flatlanders allegory. This allegory suggests that lower dimensional creatures will inevitably draw incomplete conclusions about a higher reality because they simply cannot perceive all its dimensions. Higher dimensional beings, on the other hand, can observe lower realms in an unhindered and absolute manner and manipulate virtually at will. It's compared to UFO sightings. A bouncing ball appears and disappears to a Flatlander who labels it a UFO. But it's easily explainable to a 3D person who can see its full trajectory.
Okay, so this philosophical framework then leads to a critique of Occam's razor, the principle that usually favors the simplest explanation. While often helpful, the author notes that it discounts hypotheses that appear extravagant but are correct, especially when dealing with phenomena beyond our current understanding. Examples given include the initial skepticism about the true shape of the Earth or the existence of microorganisms causing disease. These were once considered extravagant, but turned out to be true. The source even provocatively suggests that UFO landings might be a more plausible explanation for crop circles than hedgehogs, as some have apparently claimed. As Sherlock Holmes wisely observed, there is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. It emphasizes the need to keep an open mind for extraordinary claims.
And this perspective truly raises an important question for us, the listener. The author is transparent about how deeply personal and, frankly, unsettling these paradigm shifts can be, often rooted in profound fear. But this emotional honesty also lays the groundwork for her argument that we must be open to extraordinary claims that traditional science might initially dismiss. The author shares her own journey, starting with a profound fear of death that developed from a childhood funeral and was intensified by the crime and riots in Los Angeles during her graduate studies. She describes experiencing daymares, near debilitating fear, before what she calls a miraculous healing through prayer in a power encounter class, which also healed a heart murmur she had. She also recounts overcoming a deep-seated fear of rejection and failure from her competitive figure skating past. The mare subsequently drove her to be an overachiever, only to realize, in her words, the Lord's better plan for her life.
It's clear this personal journey profoundly impacted her willingness to embrace these new paradigms. The author openly admits her initial resistance to writing about megalithic civilizations and the Great Pyramid, finding the idea seemingly absurd at first. However, she describes sensing an undeniable Holy Spirit's lead, believing a connection truly exists between the Federal Reserve and the Great Pyramid, even if she couldn't immediately grasp it. She committed to following this guidance, even when it meant spending 9 months on just one chapter, without knowing where the research would ultimately lead her. Her acceptance of theories like extraterrestrial beings and UFOs stemmed directly from this research, demonstrating her willingness to embrace these paradigm shifts when the evidence for her became compelling. This journey culminates in a powerful dream about naming her son Titus Dominion, which she later understood as a revelation about the Dominion Mandate. And this sets the stage for the next major section, what the author calls the Seed War and the Nephilim Agenda.
Okay, so our deep dive now plunges directly into the spiritual realm, beginning with what the source describes as God's original dominion and family mandates. Yahweh's initial plan, the author explains, was for Adam to govern earth, extending heaven's reign and populating the world with eternal beings who would reflect divine nature. However, the fall introduced sin, creating this profound barrier between God and humanity. Adam and Eve were removed from the Garden of Eden, prevented from eating from the tree of life, which the author interprets as preventing the eternal perpetuation of their now sinful nature.
So, in this narrative, how is this profound spiritual breach addressed? How did humanity get back on track, so to speak? The author explains Yahweh's rescue plan involves sending prophets throughout history and ultimately Jesus, whom she refers to as the second Adam, as the ultimate sacrifice. The sacrifice, she posits, was designed to restore humanity's relationship with God and to resuscitate the human spirit, leading to the theological concept of being born again.
And what's truly fascinating here, from the author's interpretive lens, is that Jesus' encounter with Satan in the wilderness wasn't just a personal test. It was a cosmic battle, a battle to reclaim the dominion authority that Adam had squandered in the fall. Jesus, she notes, overcame the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, the very same temptations that caused Adam and Eve to stumble. The source emphasizes this moment as absolutely critical for humanity's hope. It notes that Jesus did not refute Satan's apparent authority over the kingdoms of the world at that moment, but critically refused to worship him. thereby securing humanity's spiritual future and paving the way for the restoration of that original dominion.
Right. And this restored dominion authority was then, according to the author, delegated to humanity through the Great Commission. That's in Matthew 28:1 and 20, where Jesus declares, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations." The idea in this framework is that Earth was to be a colony of heaven, and humans are delegated as governors, tasked with extending God's reign and influence throughout the world.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really central concept in the author's thesis: the Nephilim and the fallen sons of God, mentioned in Genesis 6. The source clarifies that sons of God are referred to as B'nai Elohim in Hebrew. She translates this as divine beings with higher-level responsibilities or jurisdictions than typical angels. Created before Earth itself, as suggested in Job 38:6-7. These beings, she explains, are considered part of God's original family. The Book of Watchers, from the extra-biblical text 1 Enoch, is cited as revealing that entities like Azazel and Semjaza reveal eternal secrets which men were striving to learn. This striving to learn, in the author's view, is directly linked to occult endeavors and the pride of life. Furthermore, Mesopotamian tradition, the source notes, states that all priestly sciences originated divinely in the antediluvian age, brought by these culture heroes like Olas. This body of knowledge, she asserts, forms the esoteric knowledge that secret societies seek after.
Okay, now, a pivotal question for the author's narrative. How were Nephilim present after the Great Flood? That seems like a contradiction if the flood wiped everything out. The source addresses this by discussing two main theories: the multiple incursion theory, which posits that the behavior described in Genesis 6 happened again or continued after the flood, and the single incursion theory. The author synthesizes these views, suggesting both are actually true. She explains that the antediluvian incursion was a massive assault by 200 watchers, leading to the creation of the original Nephilim of renown. The post-flood spread, exemplified by figures like Nimrod and events like the Tower of Babel, was, in her words, more insidious, involving multiple pathways for this genetic or spiritual influence to persist.
Right, and the key to understanding this persistence, according to the author, lies in the modern scientific field of epigenetics. She defines epigenetics as the impact our thoughts and lifestyle choices have on our body, soul, and spirit, as well as impacting our future generations. Essentially, epigenetic marks can turn on or turn off specific genes, influencing an organism's traits without changing the underlying DNA sequence. The source provides some compelling examples. Agouti mice studies, where a mother's diet can literally turn off a gene responsible for yellow coat, obesity, and disease propensity in her offspring. It also highlights transgenerational communication, like studies suggesting prepubescent boys' overeating or smoking habits can affect the lifespans of their sons and even grandsons. Another example is maternal rat studies, where licking and grooming by the mother can remove silencing marks on genes related to stress handling, making the offspring more resilient. Dr. Caroline Leaf, a cognitive neuroscientist, is quoted as stating that epigenetics is really ancient science described in the Bible, citing the proverb, "As a man thinks, so is he." Our choices are signal switches for our genes. The author concludes that the good, bad, and ugly can come through generations via these marks, but importantly, your mind is the signal that can influence these genetic expressions.
Wow, okay. This fascinating concept of epigenetics is then directly applied to Ham, Noah's son, and Nimrod, Ham's grandson, to explain the post-flood presence of Nephilim traits. The author suggests that Ham's wife was a likely carrier of the Nephilim gene. Furthermore, Ham's iniquity, as she puts it, of disrespectfully gazing at Noah's nakedness is posited to have created a predisposition for sexual perversion within his lineage through these epigenetic mechanisms. Then there's Nimrod. His very name, the author explains, means rebellion or the valiant. She points out that the Hebrew word chalal, translated as he began in Genesis when referring to Nimrod becoming mighty, can also mean to profane, defile, or pollute oneself through ritual or sexual means. And Gibor, the Hebrew word often translated as mighty men, frequently refers specifically to Nephilim or giants in biblical texts.
Exactly. So the argument here is that Nimrod essentially defiled his genome by engaging in ritualistic sexual acts, which in turn unzipped the dormant Nephilim gene, allowing him to develop the Nephilim phenotype, a physical manifestation of these giant traits. This is presented as a plausible explanation for the appearance of Nephilim after the flood, without necessarily requiring additional angelic incursions, though the author does accept both theories as potentially true. Nimrod in this framework is identified as Satan's first attempt at raising up a type of Antichrist. He's seen as the first world leader, and indeed the first globalist. His kingdom, marked by cities like Babel, Erech, and Akkad, reflects his tyrannical reign. The Tower of Babel itself is described not just as a tower, but as a stargate, maybe an Einstein-Rosen bridge to the heavenly throne. Its design, the author claims, was inspired by forbidden knowledge obtained from those fallen watchers.
Okay, so what does all this Nimrod, Babel, epigenetics, the Nephilim gene, what does this mean for us and the central premise about the Federal Reserve? The author claims the entire Federal Reserve System is rooted in nasha, that Hebrew word meaning deceive, beguile, mentally delude, and morally seduce. And that the elite banksters behind it, she asserts, exuded Nephilim traits, systematically lying to Americans while crafting an insidious system of enslavement. These men of renown, a phrase from Genesis 6 linked to the Nephilim, uses the Hebrew word Shem, which the author notes also means monument. This leads her to speculate that the Nephilim were the builders of megalithic structures like Stonehenge, Baalbek, Gilgal-Rephan, and maybe even the Great Pyramid, due to their monumental scale. Nimrod's tyranny is underscored. He was a mighty hunter against the Lord, setting up idolatry to confirm his usurped dominion and daring heaven with his impieties. He wasn't just hunting animals in this interpretation. He was a hunter of the sons of men, forcing them to adhere to the judgment of Nimrod.
Right. And this raises an important question within the author's framework regarding modern practices. The author posits that the modern celebration of the Nativity on December 25th is actually a form of syncretism. Syncretism being the blending of different religious beliefs and practices. She claims it's rooted in the counterfeit nativity of Semiramis and Horus, which she describes as defilement of the sacred. This ties back directly to the idea of ancient pagan rituals subtly influencing modern practices, often unknowingly. It further illustrates the pervasive nature of this unfiltered truth that the author claims to reveal, hidden beneath layers of tradition.
The narrative then shifts to a concept the author calls the divine counsel and judgment. Psalm 82 is cited as revealing, in her interpretation, 3 tiers of divine hierarchy. Almighty Elohim at the top, then the B'nai Elohim, those sons of God we discussed, and then angels below them. God, according to this interpretation, gave nations to the B'nai Elohim to govern, but they ruled with wickedness and injustice, and thus faced judgment from God. Babylon's prophesied destruction in Isaiah 13 is highlighted as not yet fully fulfilled, implying a future total destruction akin to Sodom and Gomorrah. The desert creatures mentioned there, like jackals and owls, are interpreted by the author not as animals, but as representations of demons or fallen gods. The owl, specifically representing Lilith, identified as one of the corrupt Psalm 82 gods. Revelation 9, describing the abyss opening and unleashing locusts with power like scorpions to torture people, is linked to the Watchers, the fallen sons of God emerging from the abyss, with Babylon becoming the future epicenter of wickedness.
And this interpretation leads directly to the infamous biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah. The author interprets this not just as a sin of homosexuality, but as a potential second incursion attempt of the Nephilim. Lot's desperate offering of his daughters to the mob is seen not as him thinking that was a lesser sin, but as a recognition that the detestable sin being sought by the mob was actually the mixing of species or interbreeding. This, she describes, would have been the vilest of all sexual acts in that specific context, trying to corrupt the human line again. The phrase, all the people from every quarter, uses the Hebrew word am, which can refer to a single race or group. The author interprets this to imply a specific racial context for this attempted incursion, possibly non-human entities. Furthermore, the cultural issues described in Ezekiel 16.4950 pride, neglect of the poor, idleness, haughtiness, are said to have culminated in abomination. The Hebrew word used is toeba, which she defines as a disgusting thing in a ritual sense, i.e. mixed marriages in this context. Jude's comparison of the flood, punishment for the first incursion, with Sodom and Gomorrah, punishment for an attempted another incursion, and the reference to seeking strange flesh, heteros in Greek, meaning not of the same nature, further supports the author's idea of attempted interbreeding between humans and angels or fallen beings.
Okay, so this cosmic war, as the author frames it, just continues. It extends to biblical giants and Israel's ongoing struggle throughout its history. Goliath, the mighty Philistine warrior, is presented as a classic Nephilim phenotype, a gibberer or mighty one. His immense strength struck fear in the Israelite army, right? The author contrasts David, the humble shepherd boy, with King Saul. Saul, instead of obeying God's command to utterly destroy the gibberer or giants in battle, instead took them in. The Hebrew word is akaf, meaning to gather or accept. He showed favoritism. This, she claims, led directly to God rejecting Saul as king. The Amalekites, a persistent enemy of Israel, are described as detestable to the Lord, not just for their merciless attacks, but for allegedly practicing interbreeding, promulgating the seed of the giver. Saul's ultimate disobedience to Karam, that divine command to utterly destroy the Amalekites, specifically by sparing their king Agag, is highlighted. It was partial obedience, which the author argues equaled disobedience, a critical turning point that ultimately cost him his kingship.
And this is where the author presents a particularly intriguing connection involving color symbolism. She suggests Esau's choice to sell his birthright for red stew, that this sealed the transaction. Aligning himself with red, the seed of Satan, and fundamentally rejecting his divine birthright. And the color red itself, she claims, is then linked consistently to sin, chaos, death, Satan, Mystery Babylon, and martyrdom throughout Scripture. The author explicitly states that red is like a calling card or a signature mark of the Edomites and/or Nephilim hosts. The Rephaim, which is the most common biblical term for giants, are described by Josephus, the ancient historian, as the offspring of the giants. Og of Bashan, a formidable giant king whose bedstead was famously the same size as a cult bed found in Babylon. This is interpreted by the author as implying he engaged in sexual rituals for breeding purposes to propagate the seed of the Nachash, serpent. His eradication by Moses was, in this view, an epic battle in the Seed War.
Okay, shifting gears slightly to the nature of these spiritual entities. The author references Michael Heiser's view on demons. Heiser notes the New Testament is largely silent on their specific origin, but Jewish texts like 1 Enoch attribute it to Genesis 6 specifically, the disembodied spirits of the dead Nephilim. These demons, in this framework, roam the earth to harass humans. They need living creatures to survive, a kind of vampiristic craving, as the author describes it, reflected in a need for blood sacrifices, sexual orgies, and cannibalistic acts to sustain themselves. In contrast, angels, the author notes based on biblical accounts, always appear in bodily form, looking just like you and me, as seen in the accounts from Sodom and Daniel 10. The source then laments Israel's failure to fully drive out their enemies during the conquest, as recorded in Judges 1.27-36. They allowed vestiges of the targeted bloodlines to remain, which, it is claimed following the biblical text, became thorns in their side, and their gods will be a trap for them.
Right, and this perspective truly raises an important question. The author concludes that this cosmic war continues. It implies Israel's ancient failures have ongoing consequences for us today. The source is clearly outlining a generational spiritual battle that persists into the modern era. Lessons from biblical conquests are highlighted as illustrations of this ongoing spiritual warfare. For example, the Battle of Jericho. It's presented not just as a military victory, but as a spiritual dimension battle against the moon god Yarek, a divine setup that mocked Canaanite rituals, resulting in utter destruction as a power encounter between Yahweh and the Amorite gods. Caleb, a biblical figure known for his faith, is celebrated as a mighty man of courage who walked in the fear of the Lord, which, according to the author, gave him extraordinary confidence to face any giant, exemplified by his taking of Hebron, a place that had become one of debauchery and wickedness inhabited by the Anakites, another giant clan. The contrast between David's lineage leading to the King of Kings and King Saul's loss of kingship due to his fear of man versus fear of the Lord is emphasized again. Finally, the narrative turns to Ephesus. There, the Apostle Paul engaged in ground-level and occult-level spiritual warfare, effectively weakening the power of the goddess Artemis. This then allowed John later to engage in strategic-level warfare by entering the temple itself when the Kairos, the opportune time, arrived. This sequence establishes a crucial principle for the author. You must proceed only on God's timing when engaging in this kind of strategic-level spiritual warfare.
Okay, now let's connect all these ancient threads. The symbols, the Nephilim, the cosmic war, to what the author claims are modern manifestations. Tracing the Edomite-Khazar, Rothschild, and Illuminati connection directly to the Federal Reserve. The source first revisits the genetic markers of the giants, outlining both physical and behavioral characteristics that it associates with the Nephilim, or, as she terms them, Nephilim hosts. Physically, excessively tall, not necessarily gigantism, but with a heavy frame, extraordinarily strong, polydactyly, that's 6 fingers or toes, and often having red hair. Behaviorally, the author states that a Nephilim host would display 3 or more of these traits if the physical criteria are met, or 5 or more otherwise. These include pervasive lust or sexual misconduct, deceit, instability, and a strong need for control, rebellious tendencies, haughtiness and pride, vengefulness, participation in sorcery or the occult, violent acts, a lack of remorse, an excessive focus on death, a dark personality often masked by self-righteousness, and dishonesty in trade.
The source then delves into physical evidence and alleged cover-ups relating to these giants. Elongated skulls found in Chungo's, Peru are highlighted, described as atypical, with complete sagittal suture obliteration and parietal foramina. This suggests, to the author, a hybrid race born with elongated heads. This is further evidence, the author claims, by the discovery of a red-haired newborn infant with an elongated skull in 2017, suggesting a genetic origin, not just head binding. Accounts of Patagonian giants from early explorers are presented as historical corroboration. Magellan reported them at 10-12 feet tall and cannibalistic. Drake described them at 8.5 feet tall with a hideous voice. Byron also noted their gigantic stature and hideous appearance.
This is truly most curious. The author suggests there's a deliberate cover-up of giant remains, particularly in North America, with the Smithsonian Institution potentially at the center of it. Sarah Winnemecke's account from the Paiute tribe of red-haired cannibals, people-eaters, is discussed. This was reportedly corroborated by 7 10-feet-tall skeletal remains found in Lovelock Cave, Nevada by miners in 1911 and later excavated by the University of California in 1912. Further discoveries in Georgia are cited. 6.5 to 7 feet tall, heavy frame skeletons unearthed at Glynn County Airport in 1936, studied by the Smithsonian. John Wesley Powell's discovery near the Etowah River, Georgia in 1883-1884 of similar 7-foot heavy framed remains. It all fuels this claim. The source implies that it's not just a few isolated discoveries. The author hints at hundreds of discoveries across America being hidden or ignored, challenging the Smithsonian's official narratives.
Yeah, what's truly fascinating here is the sheer volume of historical accounts and archaeological claims presented by the author. They all seem to point to a consistent set of characteristics of these giants. Global traces are also noted, including descriptions of red-haired and cannibalistic Celts by the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus. The source also includes contemporary accounts from the Solomon Islands by Matthias Bourrion. He claims to have encountered 10-20-foot giants with specific physical traits: long hair, bulging red eyeballs, flat noses, wide-gapped mouths, plus a distinct odor. Eyewitness accounts from government officials there are mentioned, one reporting a 15-foot skeleton, another seeing 15-foot giants lifting a truck, and evidence of 3-4-foot footprints. The author's conclusion from all this evidence is that the Nephilim agenda is like an infectious disease that is spread across time and land. She describes its reach as disturbing in its global, almost pandemic-like nature.
We then transition to what the author describes as the intricate Edomite, Khazar, Ashkenazi, and Roman connections, laying out a complex lineage, almost like a hidden bloodline theory. Ezekiel 36.5 is cited, noting the Edomites' deep hatred of Israel, how they took advantage when Jerusalem fell in 586 BC, chanting, "Tear it down," and subsequently taking over southern Judah, making Hebron their capital, later known as Idumea. C.F. Parker and Aaron L. Hayek are referenced to confirm Jewish migration into the Caucasus region. The author suggests this likely included Edomites who intermingled with Jewish populations during the Hasmonean Kingdom period when Edomites were forcibly converted.
Right, and the Jewish Encyclopedia of 1906 is referenced. It describes the Khazars as a people of Turkish origin, with a kingdom in South Russia, where Jewish communities had lived since the 1st century CE. Shlomo Sand, an Israeli historian known for his controversial work, is highlighted for discussing a mass proselytizing campaign that climaxed in Khazaria in the 8th century CE. This leads the author to suggest that a significant portion of modern Ashkenazi Jews likely originated from Khazaria due to these mass conversions, rather than solely from ancient Israelite diaspora.
So what does this all mean for this interconnected narrative the author is building? The author connects these dots, suggesting the Khazars, this powerful kingdom in Russia, mass converted to Judaism in the 8th century. And crucially, that their teachings were drawn from the Babylonian Talmud, not necessarily the Jerusalem Talmud or Torah directly. And importantly, as we just discussed, the author posits that Ashkenazi Jews likely originated largely from Khazaria. Their income, it's claimed, came from tolls and tribute from conquered peoples, and they had powerful Jewish bankers in Kiev. King Joseph's letter to Hasdai, that 10th century Khazar royal correspondence, is presented as intimating that Khazars originated from Mount Seir, the Edomite land, further linking them to the specific lineage. The lucrative Silk Road trade, the author claims, became a Jewish monopoly which influenced Turkic Khazar rulers to convert. Yiddish is even presented as emerging as a secret language for trade. The Khazars themselves are described as warlike, driven by a desire for plunder and revenge. Some historical accounts cited describe them as wild men with horrible faces and the manners of wild beasts feeding on blood. A description the author connects to the biblical figures of Gog and Magog. Their Kagan's bizarre execution ritual throttled with a silk cord, duration of reign determines his life, is also mentioned as indicative of their practices.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, This perspective suggests that the characteristics attributed to ancient Edomites, their alleged bloodthirstiness, hatred towards Jacob Israel, engagement in genocide, are mirrored in the Roman Empire's brutality, like the complete decimation of Carthage. It implies a deeper, possibly generational or spiritual lineage of certain traits and behaviors manifesting throughout history. Isaiah 34, according to medieval Rabbi Kimchi cited in the source, is interpreted as prophesying the destruction of Bozrah, a great city of Edomites, but actually referring to Rome. Kimchi stated the major part of the Romans are Edomites. William Beeston's 1858 research on the etymological link between Edom and Rome is cited, referencing Jewish Targums, ancient Aramaic interpretations. Beeston asserts quite strongly, the Romans came from Esau, who is Edom, and Italy is the Edomia, Rome the Bozrah of the Hebrew prophets. This interpretation of Lamentations 4.22 from the Jewish Targum further solidifies the claim for the author. I will visit your iniquity, Rome the impious, which you built in Italy, and you were filled with crowds of men from the posterity of Edom.
Okay, so this dense historical and interpretive lineage brings us finally to the financial nexus that the author identifies. The House of Rothschild. Their family name, Rothschild, means red shield in German. The author directly links this to the red shield carried by Caesarian soldiers and, by extension, to what she calls the lifeblood of the Church, the Vatican, the color red again. The Rothschilds are described in the source as guardians of the Vatican treasury. This suggests, in the author's view, absolute financial privacy and secrecy. And here's where the author presents a central, really startling claim. This purported appointment as Vatican guardians, she argues, explains why the Rothschilds are famous for helping nations go to war, funding both sides of conflicts to amass immense wealth and dominance. This unscrupulous method, the author claims, is woven in the fabric of the Rothschild empire, driven by a globalist desire for dominance with no loyalty to any single nation.
Meyer Amschel Rothschild's will, drawn up before his death in 1812, is highlighted as a key document in this narrative. It dictated the key positions within the family empire be held exclusively by male family members, with the eldest son leading operations. It also mandated intercousin marriages. The source notes 29 such unions in just the second and third generations, and strictly insisted on keeping the true value of his estate private, hidden from public view. This structure, the author argues, ensured a stranglehold on European nations throughout the 19th century. The narrative then shifts to the Russian Tsar Alexander I. Through the Holy Alliance Treaty, he is claimed to have thwarted Nathan Rothschild's plan for a European federation, a sort of predecessor to the modern EU. This opposition allegedly led to a death threat from Nathan Rothschild against the Tsar's entire family. Jacob Schiff, a prominent financier, is then presented as a Rothschild proxy. According to the author, he orchestrated the demise of the Romanov dynasty, ushering in Red Communism, specifically the Bolsheviks, the Reds. Communism is labeled a brutal brainchild of Karl Marx, and held responsible for 100 million deaths in the 20th century. Schiff, positioned as a main U.S. Rothschild agent, is described as instrumental in giving Paul Warburg a platform, which ultimately led to Warburg's critical role in the creation of the Federal Reserve.
Okay, so with all these historical threads, Edomites, Khazars, Romans, Rothschilds, Schiff, Warburg, what does this all mean for the Federal Reserve itself, according to the author's analysis? How did it actually come about? The narrative sets the stage with the Panic of 1907. A financial crisis marked by heavy speculation in copper, leveraged trusts operating outside regulatory oversight. Basically, chaos. This chaos, with banks stripped of reserves and widespread suicides, is said to have paved the way for banking reform. It led to the Aldrich-Vreeland Act and the National Monetary Commission, which then leads back to the infamous Jekyll Island meeting in 1910, which we mentioned earlier. It's described again as clandestine, a secret gathering of the nation's greatest bankers, ostensibly to evolve and compile a scientific currency system. Paul Warburg himself famously labeled it a bloodless revolution. Warburg's influence is particularly emphasized. The author claims he imposed his idea on a nation, attributing almost godlike, omnipotent qualities to a central bank, arguing it was necessary to protect us against others and to protect us against ourselves.
And the Federal Reserve, from this perspective, is presented as a deeply deceptive system right from its inception. The author claims the name itself is a misnomer, arguing it is either a government agency, federal, nor does it hold actual reserves. And it's not truly independent. Instead, it's portrayed as a banking cartel made up of private banks, primarily benefiting themselves and their foreign customers. Go too far. Woodrow Wilson himself, just 3 years after signing the Federal Reserve Act into law, is quoted as having confessed, maybe regretted, that the U.S. was one of the worst ruled governments in the civilized world, no longer a government by free opinion, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men.
This interpretation raises a very significant question for people today. If the Federal Reserve is described by the author as an institution of human slavery, where its primary product is literally debt, and the US dollar, now a fiat currency meaning its value isn't backed by gold but just by government decree, is designed to lose value over time through what she calls a stealth tax known as inflation, then the author is arguing that this entire system is a deliberate mechanism to confiscate your wealth slowly but surely. This alleged lack of transparency, the author highlights, is evident in things like Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell's resistance to the audit the Fed bill, and the standard 5-year delay in releasing FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, meeting transcripts. Robert Auerbach's testimony on the lack of transparency further supports the claim that the omnipotent, godlike power that Warburg infused within the DNA of the Federal Reserve still manifests with great vigor today, making it difficult for the public, or even Congress, to fully scrutinize its operations.
Okay, now we confront what the author describes as the unseen battle waged by secret societies, globalism, and the present threat, tying all these historical threads together. The source recalls those chilling warnings from past presidents. Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his farewell address, famously warned against the unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. John F. Kennedy, in a 1961 speech to newspaper publishers, issued a powerful warning about secret societies and a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means.
So what does this all mean when we consider these warnings together? It sounds quite ominous. The author brings us to a stark juxtaposition that highlights what she sees as an ongoing battle between light and darkness. This is exemplified by Ronald Reagan's warning of potentially facing 1,000 years of darkness if freedom fails, versus George H.W. Bush's very different vision of 1,000 points of light, each presenting vastly different futures or paths for the nation and the world.
Globalism, within this framework presented by the author, is described not as progress, but as a war tactic, aiming to dismantle sovereign nations, disregard traditional borders, and force mass migration to deliberately upend the cultural fabric of societies. This is directly connected back, in her view, to the Watchers, those 200 fallen angels who, according to the author's interpretation of Enoch, left their first estate or habitation and crossed boundaries to invade the Earth realm. Their goal, a coup d'etat, creating the Nephilim to ultimately thwart the birth of the Messiah. The Illuminati's origins are traced back to Jacob Frank and Adam Weishaupt joining forces the Sabbatean Frankists, a mystical Jewish movement, merging with Weishaupt's Illuminati. The author claims they were funded by the Rothschilds in Frankfurt.
Right. The Illuminati, founded on May 1st, 1776 May Day, significant in itself, is claimed to be named for Lucifer, the bearer of light. Its primary goal, allegedly, the establishment of a Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new world order. Prominent symbols like the Great Pyramid and the All-Seeing Eye, which are commonly associated with the Illuminati and Freemasonry, were notably chosen for the $1 Federal Reserve note by Franklin D. Roosevelt and Henry Wallace, both of whom, the author points out, were Freemasons. Weishaupt's alleged vision for the Illuminati was chilling: to rule in a secret society, over the best men, over men of all ranks, nations, and religions, to rule without external force, convinced that the order will rule the world.
And what's fascinating here is how the author presents these 18th century social engineering methods and then notes their eerie effectiveness, as she sees it, in the present day. Reverend Seth Payson, writing way back in 1802, detailed what he saw as the Illuminati's key infiltration methods. These included, first, using monetary or sexual bribery to control officials, and then using that information for blackmail, keeping them in line. Second, culling students with exceptional mental acuity from well-bred families, citing examples like the Rhodes Scholar Program to study global affairs and be indoctrinated. Third, placing these trained agents of the Illuminati in government as experts or advisors to steer policy in their desired direction, behind the scenes. And finally, obtaining absolute control of the press, media, to sway the public narrative and control what people think. The Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, is named by the author as essentially the Illuminati in the United States, a modern front group. Figures like Edward Mandell House, who was Woodrow Wilson's alter ego and advisor, are identified as key agents, pushing for what the author calls socialism, income tax, and a state-controlled central bank, the Federal Reserve. The controversial text, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, is cited by the author as documenting the Nephilim agenda for world domination, outlining plans for seizure of freedom, control of media, and the justification of any means, the end justifies the means, to achieve their goals. The Hegelian dialectic problem, reaction, solution, described as circles within circles and a spiraling ascension of gnosis, secret knowledge, is, according to the author, a core manipulation tactic used by Illuminists for manipulating humanity, a concept which she visually connects back to the Tower of Babel.
Okay, so what does this all mean for the present threat, according to the author's analysis? How does this manifest today? The author points to China's extensive electronic surveillance during the COVID-19 pandemic as a potential model. She then cites Henry Kissinger's 1992 quote from a Bilderberg meeting, where he apparently mused about people willingly relinquishing individual rights for the guarantee of their well-being when faced with an outside threat, whether real or promulgated. Manufactured crises. This, the author suggests, paints a picture of unfolding global health surveillance as a mechanism of control. The author provocatively questions if COVID-19 itself was merely a cover for an underlying agenda, noting what she perceives as a disparity in the global response compared to previous pandemics like H1N1, suggesting it was perhaps overblown for other purposes. St. Louis Federal Reserve President James Bullard is quoted suggesting universal daily COVID-19 testing with a badge required for work. Bill Gates' idea of digital certificates to show who has recovered or been tested recently or when we have a vaccine who has received it is also brought up. This, the author argues, further paints a picture of unfolding global health surveillance and suggests a Hegelian dialectic at play in current events. The concept of the deep state is also introduced. The author points to the huge number, over 156,000, of sealed criminal cases in U.S. federal courts, compared to just 577 in 2006, and the DEA's Project Python targeting cartels as signs of an ongoing hidden fight against this deep state.
Right, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, the ultimate spiritual source of this agenda, the author claims that a parasitic entity feeds off the usury of its captives, usury being excessive interest on loans, and that this entity and its human agents are involved in horrifying things: human trafficking, child sacrifices, sexual perversion, spirit cooking and cannibalism, money laundering, dishonest trade, and general enslavement. The globalists are explicitly identified by the author as the modern Nephilim hosts. Their ultimate aim, it is claimed, is to open a stargate to unleash the hordes of hell, and to incite wickedness, just as in the days of Noah, leading to a complete breakdown of societal order, paving the way for their Antichrist figure. The source concludes that Baal, or specifically Baal Hamon, which it translates as Lord or Possessor of Abundance, is the ruling principality, the demonic power, controlling the masterminds behind the Federal Reserve. Demons within this framework are explicitly identified as the spirits of the deceased Nephilim. The Nephilim agenda in the Common Era, the author claims, is twofold: to destroy those who follow Jesus, and to enslave the masses through control, manipulation, and domination. This agenda, she posits, is carried out by ruling families with a bloodline admixture with the Nephilim, connecting back to those ancient lineages. The Great Pyramid is theorized, in this context, not as a tomb, but as having functioned as a temple for Osiris, with the sarcophagus potentially serving as a bed of iniquity for ritualistic sex acts, with a Nephilim spirit to gain power and knowledge.
Wow, what a journey this deep dive has been. From ancient Egypt to Jekyll Island to, well, today. This comprehensive analysis, as presented by the author, certainly aims to expose what she perceives as evil lurking in the darkness and to flood it with the light of truth. As the author states, the intention is that we are now equipped to strike the mark through intercession that is informed. The call to action she presents is clear: to join the fight against what she identifies as the globalists, the Nephilim hosts, the deep state, and the Illuminati. It's framed as a spiritual battle.
Exactly. And the source reminds us of the lessons learned from those biblical giant slayers like Deborah, Joshua, Caleb, and David. Cultivating intimacy with the Lord, she argues, leads to the fear of the Lord, not terror, but reverent awe, which in turn brings supernatural strength and courage to defeat the spiritual giants of our time. We are reminded of what the author describes as our dominion authority, as Christ's ambassadors, having been given the keys to the kingdom, enabling us, in her view, to loose that which has been bound, enforcing Jesus' victory on earth, and discipling nations according to biblical principles.
And the author suggests various roles for individuals in this fight, depending on their calling and gifts. It's not just one thing. These roles include serving in governmental positions, writing books to expose these alleged truths, broadcasting through social media, fighting legal battles in courts, traveling to symbolically cut ley lines, uprooting spiritual grids, cleansing defiled portals, and engaging in strategic-level spiritual warfare through prayer.
Right. This deep dive itself, as presented by the author, was designed as a spiritual mapping investigation, To expose what she terms the ancient roots of defilement within our monetary system, specifically the Federal Reserve. The call from the author is to use this knowledge in prayer and intercession, representing the Lord's purpose, apprehending heaven's decrees for the nation, and specifically asking forgiveness through that identificational repentance for sexual perversion, immorality, idolatry, broken covenants, and bloodshed throughout history, believing this weakens demonic strongholds, breaks curses, and releases blessings. The ultimate goal, as she states it, is to see America and we the people transformed for the glory of the Lord.
So as you reflect on this deep dive, all the claims and connections laid out by the author, consider this. If these ancient, unseen forces have indeed shaped our modern world in such profound and hidden ways as the author claims, how might recognizing their potential influence empower your discernment and reshape your decisions, especially when confronting what seems to be just an obvious fact?